Hi, Freddie. This is chapter number 5 of The Lion, the Wardrobe, and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Remember, chapter 4 left us where the four kids were playing hide and go seek, and um, and Edward went into the wardrobe um, after Susie or Lucy, and he actually came across the witch, and he kind of got he got promised all these things if Edward would bring the kids, the rest of his sisters and brothers, back to Narnia, that he would actually end up being the king someday. Um, and he was eating all that really nice, rich pastries that he loved, and that was actually putting a spell on him. So now they had just gotten out of the closet, the wardrobe, and they're going to go find their friends. So chapter 5 is entitled "Back on This Side of the Door." Because the game of hide and seek was still going on, it took Edwin and Lucy some time to find the others. But when at last they were all together, which happened in a long room where the suit of armor was, Lucy burst out, "Peter, Susan, it's all true. Edmund has seen it too. There is a country you can get to through the wardrobe. Edward and I got in. We met one another in there, in the woods. Go on, Edward, tell them all about it." "What's this all about, Ed?" said Peter. "And now we can go to one of the nastiest things in the story. Up to that moment, Edmund was feeling sick and sulky and annoyed with Lucy for being right, but he hadn't made up his mind what to do. When Peter suddenly asked him the question, he decided all at once to do the meanest and the most spiteful thing he could think of. He decided to let Lucy down. "Tell us, Ed," said Susan. And Edward gave a very superior look as if he was far older than Lucy, though they really were a year's difference. And then a little snaggier and said, "Oh, yes, Lucy and I have been playing, pretending that all her story about the country in the wardrobe is true. Just for fun, of course. There's nothing there, really." Poor Lucy gave Edwin one look and rushed out of the room. Edmund, who was becoming a nastier person every minute, thought that he had scored a great success, and went on at once to say, "There she goes again. What's the matter with her? That's the worst of young kids. They always—" "Look here," said Peter, turning on him savagely. "Shut up. You've been perfectly beastly to Lou ever since she started this nonsense about the wardrobe. And now you go playing games with her about it and setting her off again. I believe you did it simply out of spite." "But it's all nonsense," said Edward, very taken back. "Of course it's all nonsense," said Peter. That's just the point. Lou was perfectly all right when we left home. But since we've been down here, she seems to be either going queer in the head or else turning into the most frightful liar. But whatever it is, what good do you think you'll do by jeering and nagging at her one day and encouraging her the next?" I thought," Edward said, but he couldn't think of anything to say. "You don't think anything at all," said Peter. "It's just spite. You've always liked being beastly to anyone smaller than yourself. We've seen it at school before now." Do stop it, said Susan. It won't make things any better having a row between you two. Let's go and find Lucy. It was not surprising that when she found Lucy, a good deal later, everyone could see that she had been crying. Nothing they could do to her made any difference. She stuck to her story and said, I don't care what you think, and I don't care what you say. You can tell the professor, or you can write to mother, or you can do anything you like. I know I've met a Fran in there, and I wish I stayed there. And you all are beast. Beast. It was unpleasant. It was an unpleasant evening. Lucy was miserable, and Edward was beginning to feel that his plan wasn't working as well as he had expected. The two older ones were really beginning to think that Lucy was out of her mind. They stood in the passageway talking about it in whispers long after she'd gone to bed. The result was the next morning they decided that they really would go and tell the whole thing to the professor. He'll write to father if he thinks there is really something wrong with Lou, said Peter. It's getting beyond us. So they went and knocked at the study door, and the professor said, Come in, and got up and found chairs for them, and said he was quite at their disposal. Then he sat listening to them with tips of his fingers pressed together and never interrupting till they finished the whole story. After that, he said nothing for quite a long time. Then he cleared his throat and said the last thing either of them expected. How do you know, he asked, that your sister's story is not true? Oh, but, began Susan, and then stopped. Anyone could see that the old man's face, that he was perfectly serious. Then Susan pulled herself together and said, But Edmund said they were only pretending. That is a point, said the professor, which certainly deceives consideration, very careful consideration. For instance, if you will excuse me for asking the question, does your experience lead you to regard your brother or your sister as a more reliable? I mean, which is the most truthful? That's just the funny thing about it, sir, said Peter. Up till now, I've had said Lucy every time. And what do you think, my dear? Said the professor, turning to Susan. Well, said Susan, in general, I'd say the same as Peter. But this can't be true. All this about the wood and the fawn. That is more than I know. That is more than I know, said the professor. And a change of lying against someone and a charge of lying against someone whom you have always found truthful is a very serious thing, and a very serious thing indeed. We were afraid it might even be it, we're afraid it might have even been lying, said Susan. We thought there might be something wrong with Lucy. Madness, you mean? Said the professor, quite coolly. Oh, you can make your minds easily about that. One has only to look at her and talk to her to see that she is not mad. But then, said Susan, and stopped. She had never dreamed that a grown up would talk to the professor and couldn't know what to think. Logic, said the professor, half to himself. Why don't you teach? Why don't they teach logic to at these schools? There are only three possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, or she is mad, or is she telling the truth? You know she doesn't tell lies, and it's obvious that she's not mad. For the moment, then, and unless any further evidence turns up, we must assume that she's telling the truth. Susan looked at him very hard, and saw quite sure from the expression on his face that he was not making fun of them. But how could it be true, sir? Said Peter. Why do you say that? Asked the professor. Well, for one thing, said Peter, if it was real, why doesn't anyone find this country every time they go into the wardrobe? I mean, there was nothing there when we looked. Even Lucy didn't pretend there was. What has that got to do with it? Said the professor. Well, sir, if things are real, they're there all the time. Are they? Said the professor, and Peter did not know quite what to say. But there was no time, said Susan. Lucy had no time to have gone anywhere, even if there was such a place. She came running after us the very moment we were out of the room. It was less than a moment, and she pretended to have been gone for hours. That is the very thing that makes her story so likely to be true, said the professor. If there really is a door in this house that leads to some other world, and I should warn you that this is a very strange house, and even I know very little about it. If I say she had got into another world, I should not be at all surprised to find that the other world had a separate time of its own, so that however long you stay there, it would never take up any of your time. On the other hand, I don't think many girls her age would invent the idea for themselves. If she had been pretending, she would have hidden for a reasonable time before going out and telling her story. But do you really mean, sir, that there could be other worlds all over the place, just around the corner like that? Nothing is more pliable, said the professor, taking off his spectacles, his glasses, or spectacles, and beginning to polish them, while he muttered to himself, I wonder what they do teach these kids at school. But what are we to do? Said Susan. She felt that the conversation was beginning to get off the point. My dear young lady, said the professor, suddenly looking up in very sharp expression at both of them. There is one plan which no one has yet suggested, and which is well worth trying. What's that? Said Susan. We might all try minding our own business, he said, and that was the end of that conversation. After this thing, we're a good deal better off, Lucy. Peter saw to it that Edmund stopped jeering at her, and neither she nor anyone else felt inclined to talk about the wardrobe at all. It had become rather an alarming subject, and so for a time it looked as if all the adventures were coming to an end. But that was not to be. This house of the professor's, which even he knew so little about, was so old and famous that people all over England used to come and ask permission to look it over. It was the sort of house that is mentioned in guidebooks and even in historians, and well it might be, for all manners of stories were told about it, some of them even stranger than the one I am telling you now. And when parties of sightseers arrived and asked to see the house, the professor always gave them permission, and Mrs. Macready, the housekeeper, showed them around, telling them about the pictures and the armoire and the rare books in the library. Mrs. Macready was not fond of children and did not like to be interrupted when she was telling the visitors all the things that she knew. She had said to Susan and to Peter almost on the first morning, along with a good many other instructions. And please remember, you're to keep out of the way whenever I am taking a party over the house. Just as if any of us would want to waste half the morning traveling around with a crowd of strange grown-ups, said Edmund, and the other three thought the same. That was how the adventure began for the second time. A few mornings later, Peter and Edmund were looking at the suit of arms and wondering if they could take it to bits when the two girls rushed into the room and said, "Look out! Here comes the McReady and the whole gang with her." Sharp, Sharp's the word, said Peter, and all four made off through the door at the far end of the room. But when they got out into the green room and beyond it, into the library, they suddenly heard voices ahead of them and realized that Mrs. McReady must be bringing the party of sightseers up the back stairs instead of up the front stairs as they had expected. And after that, whether it was that they lost their heads or that Mrs. McReady was trying to catch them, or that some magic in the house had come to life and was chasing them into the Naria, they seemed to find themselves being followed everywhere, until at last Susan said, "Oh, brother, these trippers! Here, let's get into the wardrobe room till they're past. No one will follow us in there." But the moment they were inside, they heard voices in the passage, and then someone fumbled at the door, and then they saw the handle turning. "Quick," said Peter, "there's nowhere else," and flung open the wardrobe. All four of them huddled inside and sat there panting in the dark. Peter held the door closed, but did not shut it, for of course he remembered, as every sensible person does, that you should not never shut yourself up in a wardrobe. Okay, so that's end of chapter 5. So they now believe that they talked to the professor about this, and they thought, well, she's not making up stories, she's not lying, but they really still don't know what to think. And now they're trapped they're in the wardrobe. I wonder if they're going to end up going into the forest, all four of them. I think we'll find out next chapter.